If you take the history of the armed conflict, armed ethnic conflict in Sri Lanka, you will see that the Tamil movement, which started off as a small scale, low intensity guerrilla conflict, guerrilla movement, expanded almost overnight, almost in the course of 5-6 months, when India got involved in 1983. India's involvement was large, as it has done in that period in other parts of South Asia and Central Asia, not Central Asia, in Afghanistan and in that region. India had reasons to believe that the Sri Lankan government was moving into the US sphere of influence. In 1983, the Sri Lankan government renewed a 10-year contract to upgrade for America to acquire 1,000 acres of land on Sri Lanka's west coast, to upgrade its Voice of America and upgrade and build a new larger Voice of America facility. Now, India and Russia at that time accused the US of setting up extreme low frequency transmitters in the Voice of America station. And these transmitters, the ELF transmitters, were apparently meant to detect the movement of Russian nuclear submarines in the Indian Ocean, which India also objected to, that the US was using the Voice of America agreement to set up monitoring facilities that were going against India's strategic interests, strategic security environment, what India called its strategic security environment in the south. Plus, India assumed that the Sri Lankan government was going to hand over a large tank farm in Trincomalee to the US through companies registered in Singapore, and there were some devious and surreptitious deals to give this tank farm in Trincomalee, to bring this tank farm under US control. And also the United Kingdom had sent its special forces to train the Sri Lankan army, and the Sri Lankan government was openly seeking military assistance against the Tamil liberation movement from the US. And in 1983, around this time, the Sri Lankan government openly urged the British government to renew a defense treaty that had become defunct in 1956. After the Suez Canal closed, the British Royal Navy no longer needed Sri Lanka as a forward base to control Asia, or to have a vantage point in Asia, which they did during World War II, when Sri Lanka was the Southeast Asia headquarters for the Royal Navy. So India armed the Tamil movement and expanded it to apply pressure on the Sri Lankan government to toe the line. By 1987, the Sri Lankan government realized that it could not counter India's tactics in arming the Tamil movement. India itself had no interest in seeing Tamils seceding from Sri Lanka, because then it would have a rebound effect in South India. So they want to use the Tamil liberation movement as an instrument to bring pressure on the Sri Lankan government, and then to compel the Sri Lankan government to sign a treaty where the Sri Lankan government gave up its external self-determination. That is, under the treaty, which it was signed, which the Sri Lankan government signed under duress after a direct threat from India. It is prevented from handing over Trincomalee to anyone but India. It is prevented from allowing foreign intelligence and military personnel from operating in Sri Lanka without India's sanction, and using the Voice of America without India's supervision. Any instruments to be installed in the Voice of America station had to be, under the treaty, had to be inspected by India. So like this, and the treaty also required that Sri Lanka train its armed forces and have armed forces in India and have intelligence exchange primarily with India. So with the treaty, Sri Lanka was expected to come within the Indian strategic fold. Now this has changed this has been changing over time. The US has tried to sign a defense treaty called Access and Cross Servicing Agreement, which it has signed with Philippines to make up for the loss of the Subic Bay. And this Access and Cross Servicing Treaty allows the US to turn Sri Lanka into a Germany. Like, it can have its own bases, it can come and go at will, it can bring in nuclear armed ships or planes. But India stopped. But with that, a certain Cold War has begun in Sri Lanka, where the US government is very obviously trying to bring the Colombo governments under its influence through using economic means, trade pacts. They have been using various means, and also the US has been heavily involved in training the Sri Lankan army, and there was an increasing level of special forces presence, US special forces presence in the northeast, although they were not directly involved in combat. Some of the what I would call the vanguard units of the Sri Lankan army were trained and raised by the US Pacific Command. But of course, that they were completely defeated is another story. But it has so there has been an escalation where obviously the US wants a foothold, because there is no reason for the US to persuade the Sri Lankan government to sign the Access and Cross Servicing Treaty, which it has signed with Philippines to make up for the loss of the Subic Bay. This internationalization, or the Sri Lanka becoming a place where there is an international power struggle, can threaten the is threatening the peace process itself. Because peace is not actually in the minds of those who are trying to gain a foothold. Where it is instability that they need. Either total instability or a government that would toe their line. But here is a situation where India is also trying to prevent this. So what we see today is kind of a cold war between India and the US-led coalition, basically US and the United Kingdom. So the question before the Tamils is to see that they don't get sucked into this situation and thereby allow anarchy to prevail, because anarchy would be the thing that these powers would want. If you look at how the Americans use the Pashtuns, the Pathans in Afghanistan against the pro-Soviet regime. Then how India has used the Chakma rebellion to destabilize the southern parts of Bangladesh, or how the various ethnic groups in Central Asia are being, how the Chechnyans are being manipulated. You find only kind of what they call terrorism, but it is violence that is manipulated by the big powers to keep the pot boiling. But end of the day, the people suffer. So the question before the Tamil people is to see that they steer clear of this while maintaining their advantage. Because this involves problems of the big powers seizing your weapon shipments, or sending out closing down your political offices. Or there are a lot of challenges, but the main thing is to see that you have a foothold in your own homeland, that you have internal mechanisms whereby you prevent the whole society from collapsing, build very strong basis for the society to prevent it from collapsing, and also see that opportunistic forces that can side with these external powers are neutralized in the sense that they are made to see political reason and become part of the nationalist cause. So there is an important need for the Sri Lankan Tamil movement to save itself or protect itself from the kind of international strategic maneuvering that is taking place now in that part of the Indian Ocean. And China is emerging as a big player in this game. China too has to ensure its growing energy demand.
For the first time it has to import.
Energy demands are increasing. So China too has to look after the sea lanes. But if the US controls the sea lanes or dominates the sea lanes at these crucial strategic points, it will give the US a specific advantage. It currently enjoys in the Hormuz Strait. Hormuz Strait, all ships that pass through Hormuz Straits are checked by US Special Forces, boarded and checked. Terrorism is the excuse. But they check here, they check in the Philippines archipelago, also they do that. So, in the emerging global equation, there is a situation in which we find ourselves, and it is the biggest challenge before the Tamil people today, to see that their cause is not crushed under the boots of the big powers who
What kind of development do you see in the next time concerning this strategic interests?
Now we see a Cold War emerging between the US and India. But key to this equation would be how the peace talks go. So I think the US wants to dominate the peace talks and development. They're going to have some donor conference on their own, for Sri Lanka. So it's right now it's very difficult to say, because the US, or for that matter India, don't have an ideal situation to directly and easily intervene. Because you must understand that any foreign intervention requires certain ground realities, like totally divided people, several militia, several centers of power, which can be manipulated. One can be played against the other, and you can, like Iraq was a Shia majority country ruled by a Sunni minority, which was deliberate. That was a deliberate design. If you look at the Middle East, the British deliberately handed over power to minorities, vulnerable minorities, who, to make up for their minority position, their vulnerability, political vulnerability, would depend on the West. So you don't find those conditions in Sri Lanka among the Tamils, because there aren't many groups to play around with, and those groups, and there aren't any moderates and militants, and there's no moderate militant sort of opposition. Everybody is saying the same thing. So the ground conditions are yet to evolve, or in a way that the US would like it or India would like it, but it's not going in the way that they would, because they need anarchy, they need the disruption of the social fabric. They need people who are refugees to become informants, to become militias. They need completely uprooted societies to manipulate that. If you look at Congo, and also the Tamils sit on top of some of the best titanium ores in the world. Titanium dioxide is made from ilmenite, and very rich ilmenite and rutile are found on the northeast coast, of which the Japanese were the big buyers, or Japanese were just playing out the Sri Lankan government, and the LGS put a stop to that. And there are other things like, so for all this, as long as the Tamils retain their sovereignty over their internal and external affairs, it's going to be a difficult task for external powers to easily intervene. I am not saying that they cannot intervene, but they find it a bit difficult to intervene. And so basically the Tamils have to guard against social disruption, see that their society is properly rebuilt. Because one of the first conditions for exploitation is to see that society loses its sovereignty. A good example is Congo, I think, where, all our cell phones, our handies, require mineral called, you know that story, right? Yeah. So Congo, they buy it cheap because Congo doesn't have any sovereignty, and each militia is selling it at cutthroat prices. They don't have the sovereignty to negotiate the uranium, and Congo is one of the largest producers of uranium. And we don't know who is producing and who is buying. Nobody talks about it. We only hear about massacres where 300,000 people have been killed. Nobody talks that. That brings us back to the media. The big media doesn't even touch on the matter. We don't even hear about it.